The BBC have come under fire recently for one of their skit shows over on BBC Radio 4 aimed towards Sir Keir Starmer, who of course has just become the Prime Minister of the UK. Now, the skewer is basically a bit of a, edgy kind of soundbite thing for BBC Radio 4, and they did a special one for the general election, of course Rishi Sunak versus Sir Keir Starmer, where they brought up Sir Keir Starmer's dead mother. Now, this was quite tasteless, even by the standards of dark humour. So, I don't think this one can necessarily be guised behind dark humour, but we're going to get into the whole situation today to try kind of cover it. So, Sir Keir Starmer, his mother did sadly pass away. So this was an episode on Piers Morgan's Life Stories, where Sir Keir covered basically recalls the moments of his mother's passing. I'm just going to bop right on in here. It is Ben of the future. Well, future Ben of the Ben you've just seen. I've put in a little segment that you were about to watch, which was about Keir Starmer, obviously opening up about the passing of his mother and how distraught he was, and his family, of course. It was quite a heart-tugging moment. But ITV did what ITV do best, which is copyright strike me. Yeah, they were like, no, you can't include that because it came from the Piers Morgan Life Stories. So what I'll do is I'll add a link for anyone that wants to see it down in the description so you can see that for yourselves. But unfortunately, I couldn't include it in my video. Sorry for that, guys, but let's continue. Wow, so obviously very distraught there, very, very hard-hitting interview. But the BBC have done what the BBC do, basically, well, not best, because they are very politically correct. And of course, regardless of political standing, at the end of the day, this is a human being with real feelings, real emotions, politics aside. But BBC Sounds have got The Skewer. So a synopsis for this is: a twisted comedy treat. John Holmes brings you the week's biggest stories like you've never heard them before. The news remixed. Welcome to The Skewer. Headphones on. And then there is basically a playlist here. But the BBC may have taken it a little bit too far with this one, as Sir Keir Starmer always made reference to his dad being a toolmaker. I think it was basically him trying to be relatable to the general public. Of course, he is the head of the Labour Party, which is supposed to represent the people, not just the wealthy. It's no secret that the Conservatives are, the BBC are huge backers of the Conservatives. Like, the head of the BBC has always been kind of donating, money to the Conservative Party and stuff like this. But they have come under severe scrutiny as they played a clip from The Exorcist, where it was basically a soundbite where it says, "Your mother sucks cock in hell." And that's what has come to the limelight recently. So we're going to take a little look at this interview that really breaks it down and it goes into detail about the entire situation, as well as playing the clip in its entirety.
So The Skewer, which is a BBC satirical programme, it's been going for 11 series. They did a special programme on the election. They decided to take the mickey out of Keir Starmer. That's okay, talking about his dad being a toolmaker, and of course sometimes we take the mickey out of Keir Starmer saying his father was a toolmaker, my father was a toolmaker. It's something he says.
Obviously, that's just something, I'm assuming that's something that he says to try and be relatable to the general audience and the general public, to make himself seem like there's not this huge wealth divide between the two, even though we all know there is. But, something that he does. It's better than not having Sky at home, I suppose, as a kid.
Pretty often. But then they broadcast a little clip from The Exorcist, the film that I've never seen and never want to see, but I know that there are a lot of highly offensive things in there. So when talking about his father,
I'm sure we're all aware of what The Exorcist is. Pop culture classic. It's a cult classic movie about the kid that gets possessed. I can't remember the name of the girl. Her head turns 360 degrees. She eats the spiders and the bugs in her room, and it's all about the exorcism of this child and how they try and get this demon spirit out of her.
Then broadcast this, what I believe to be highly offensive, comment about his mother. This is what the BBC broadcast.
I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker, he worked in a factory. It's true, my mum... Your mother sucks cocks in hell. Which actually isn't a laughing matter, we couldn't make ends meet.
So...
Yeah. That's not great, is it? That's just not a good look. When put in that context, obviously the idea and the premise of the show was to kind of put it into a context of earning a living. So for a living, his dad was a tool maker, and they basically clipped this together to make it sound like, you know, and my mother, your mother sucks cocks in hell, but we had to make ends meet. Basically alluding to prostitution to make money, which, I mean, taking the mick out of someone's dead mother, regardless of politics again, by the way, like, you know, I don't want to start a political war down in the comments, because this isn't about that. This is about human emotions. And, you know, taking the mick out of someone's dead mother is one thing. You know, like, you can, with some people, they can take it well. With some people, you know, it's a bit of a raw subject. So you've got to know your audience, first of all. But then to add that into the context of prostitution as well, that's not exactly, you know, it's a bit of a double whammy. That it's like, you know, you've hit once and then you've gone for an uppercut. It's not a great look.
He said the words "your mother," then the BBC, apologies, broadcast a clip which said from The Exorcist, "Your mother sucks cocks in hell." Let's hear a slightly slower version of that. It was very, very fast, so let's just hear a slightly slower version of that.
When I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory. It's true. My mum... Your mother sucks cocks in hell. Which actually isn't a laughing matter. We couldn't make ends meet.
So obviously that is alluding to her. That's how she would make money. You know, that's just not great.
So Keir Starmer is talking about his family.
And I want to preface this. I feel like I've got quite a dark sense of humour. I can, like, you know, I'll find Ricky Gervais hilarious because it's edgy comedy. Jimmy Carr, for example, I think he's hilarious. It's edgy comedy, very close to the bone, very close to, you know, career cancelling kind of comedy. But there is a very fine line between comedy and just taking things way too far. And I feel like this has really overstepped that mark. Maybe some people find that hilarious. Maybe you don't like Keir Starmer, whatever. Regardless, again, of your political opinions, I see this kind of from a, you know, from a person who's, my partner's lost their mum, you know, and I know how hard that can be. I feel like that's quite a, you know.
He says the words, "my mother," then the BBC decides, because it's, in their view, funny, to broadcast a clip from The Exorcist talking about this woman who had Still's disease, who had a life-limiting condition. "Your mother sucks cocks in hell." That's what the BBC decided to broadcast. Now, I asked the BBC a number of questions about this. I asked them, why was the decision made to broadcast this comment on Radio 4, the BBC's flagship speech station? Can you confirm this episode went through the BBC's editorial processes, including sign-off by senior management? Can you explain why the BBC felt this comment was appropriate to broadcast about the deceased mother of the Prime Minister, a woman who suffered from Still's disease, which involved her losing her ability to speak, which meant she had never spoken to her grandchildren? Josephine Baker, who's Sir Keir Starmer's mother, also had her leg amputated as a result of Still's disease. Fourth question, will you now remove this episode of The Skewer from the BBC iPlayer or edit the episode? This is still on the BBC iPlayer. Children can listen to this. They can go on the BBC iPlayer and they can listen to this, although there is a flag that it is age-restricted content. I asked the BBC those four questions. This was their response.
I'll be very intrigued to see the response from the BBC, to see how they work around this.
A BBC spokeswoman said, "The Skewer is well known for its surreal and acerbic approach to comedy, weaving together audio clips from across popular culture and the media. When heard in context, the clip in question is clearly part of a satire on the repeated references to family members and background during the election debates, rather than a direct comment on Sir Keir Starmer's mother. Comedy is subjective, and while we understand that not everything will be to everyone's taste, the content and language is within audience expectations for this multi-award-winning satirical programme." I just want to play the clip again, one more time, because they're saying that this is, they're saying the clip in question is clearly part of a satire on the repeated references to family members and background during the election debates, rather than a direct comment on Sir Keir Starmer's mother. Well, he immediately before the clip is played says, "my mother," then they decide to say, "your mother sucks cocks in hell." Let's play this one more time.
I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker, he worked in a factory. It's true, my mum... Your mother sucks cocks in hell. Which actually isn't a laughing matter, we couldn't make ends meet.
Let's talk to Barney Chowdhury. He's editor-at-large of Eastern Eye. He's a lecturer in journalism at the University of East Anglia. He's also a former non-executive director of Ofcom and worked for the BBC for a while as a correspondent, social affairs correspondent. Barney, what do you make of this?
Well, I'm appalled by two things. First of all, that the BBC would defend this. It's not funny. It's not satire.
See, I completely understand that comedy is absolutely subjective. And, you know, like I say, I feel like I've got quite a dark sense of humour. I can see, you know, as long as it's within good context, you know, dark humour can be funny. Obviously, like I say, Ricky Gervais and Jimmy Carr are probably some of the greatest comedians to go down the dark route, because they know where that very fine line is and they can tread on it, but not always cross it. There have been times where they've obviously crossed it, but because they're comedians, they can take it and they can, you know, they can work it into another thing. And I just feel like this one is a bit more, just a bit more over that line, and it's not, you know, I don't know. I don't know how to, what I'm trying to say is basically Jimmy Carr, Ricky Gervais, two people obviously known for their dark humour. You know that they're going to go down this kind of dark humour route, and that, you know, you expect that from their comedy. But from the BBC, it's a bit more like, you know, they're a bit more PG with this kind of thing. They're a bit, even on The Skewer, you know, I've looked at a couple of other episodes and they're nowhere to this kind of level. This one really, like, tried to tread that line and got it so far over that it's, like, caused quite some quite severe backlash.
It's offensive. Pure and simple. In my humble view, they broke the Ofcom rule of harm and offence, Section 2. There is no way on earth that you can defend this, and this is the problem with the BBC, that it tries to defend the indefensible. How on earth can it say that this is comedy? This is okay to attack and ridicule politicians. They're fair game. But why would you go after somebody who can't defend themselves, who's passed away, and actually helped the NHS and brought up our future Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think that is actually within context fair. I'm not to say, like, you know, nobody's out of the realms of comedy. Nobody's untouchable from comedy. You know, I have no doubt that there will be comedy, you know, not even like something as horrific as 9/11 is out of the realms of comedy. It shouldn't be part of comedy, but, you know, comedians make it part of their content. But it's always within context. Like, you know, you usually dead people, you leave out of comedy. You try and leave that, unless it's, you know, they're known for some very horrific things. I'm not going to name names, but, you know, then we can, you know, then it's almost kind of fair game.
Pam has been in touch and says, I'm not a fan of Keir Starmer or the Labour Party, but I really think it is time the BBC no longer had an obligatory licence fee. This is utterly disgusting. Do you agree with that?
I think the BBC makes mistakes. I don't agree with the fact that we should take away the licence fee, not because I work for them or still work for them in some capacity or another. I just think it is important that we have a national broadcaster. But along with that comes responsibility, and that responsibility is to make sure it understands the mood of the nation and tells us things that are editorially compliant. We hold the BBC up to a higher standard, and in my opinion, that they have failed abjectly to even think about what the outcome of this is going to be. You know, it reminds me of that awful interview and thing that went on with a few years ago with Russell Brand and the
Andrew Sachs on Radio 2.
Yeah, and it reminds me of that. And I just think that the BBC just defends itself. It doesn't understand. It feels it's under attack and will defend itself until somebody sort of sits down and thinks, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. We apologise. We'll learn lessons from it.
What processes will this have gone through, Barney? What you know, since you mentioned the Andrew Sachs, Jonathan Ross scandal a few years ago in the BBC, we've been told things have been tightened up on this. We've been told the BBC shouldn't be broadcasting this sort of highly offensive material, especially against a dead woman who just happens to have been the mother of the Prime Minister. I mean, what processes will this have been through?
So when I was an output editor for Radio 5 Live, if there was anything which I thought was going to be getting us into trouble editorially, we have a process called referring up, and you work for the BBC, so you will know this. On something like this is a pre-recorded programme. It has the F word all the way through this, and as a result of that, it should have been listened to straight away. Somebody should have listened to this at a senior editorial level and signed it off. That's what compliance is about. Certainly, I've been on many training courses when I was part of the BBC on compliance and what's offensive and what isn't offensive, what's defamation and what isn't defamation. The BBC is very, very good at training its staff. I think somebody didn't watch this, didn't listen to it, or if they did, there's been a huge error of judgment.
Jason has been in touch. He says, I can't believe what I have just heard. How on earth can this be defended by the BBC? It is completely unacceptable. Mary in County Down says, political satire is central to British cultural life and our values around freedom of speech, but we don't tolerate or endorse obscene cruelty. And this so-called comedy sketch was obscene, cruel, outrageous and deeply unfunny. No one can be surprised that the out-of-touch BBC has doubled down on this disgraceful episode. A committee of Aren't We Clever producers, editors and managers conceived this, approved it and signed it off. They're paid with our licence fee to insult the memory of the Prime Minister's mother. That's unacceptable. I think they'll rethink the decision not to edit or remove the show, and I have no expectation that they will act properly. Dell in Swansea says, how much lower can the BBC sink? They're a disgrace. The licence fee should be scrapped. Brian in Kent says, morning, I'm not a fan of Labour, but Starmer needs to sue the hell out of the BBC. This is disgusting and very distasteful. How they defend this escapes me. It's time to get rid of the BBC. Cliff in Manchester says,
I think that's very strong, to say to get rid of the BBC as a whole. No one likes having to pay a licence fee to the BBC in the UK. I don't know if Americans have it. I'm not sure if other countries have it. But in the UK, we pay a licence fee to the BBC, which basically you pay it like quarterly, so every 3 months or so. It's not a lot of money, but you pay it, and it basically is you're paying to have terrestrial TV. So ITV, BBC channels, Channel 4, Channel 5, and then if you want your Sky's, Virgins, you pay that on top of the licence fee. And no one likes paying it. It's just one of those things that it's like tax. No one wants to pay tax. You've got to pay tax. But at the same time, to scrap the BBC entirely off the back of this is quite a big thing to say. I don't think they need to be... Yes, they need to learn from this, but, they need to learn from a lot of things, just like the rest of us, I suppose.
I don't see the problem at all. It's satire. Comedy is sometimes offensive to some and funny to others. You're blowing it up out of all proportion. Are we blowing this out of all proportion, Barney?
I don't think you are. I think that it's a case of... And we can have indignation. Of course we can. And of course I believe in the freedom of expression, Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Of course I believe in all that. But there is a line, there is a fine line, and I'm afraid the BBC has crossed it. The only way it's going to listen is if people complain. And that's what I'd urge people to do, complain. Have an inquiry into this. And then somebody somewhere should listen to it. Ask yourself a question if you're a producer of a satire programme, which is this. If you were talking about your mother like that, would you find that acceptable? If not, then why did you do it for somebody who can't defend herself? That's the point for me.
I should say I did approach 10 Downing Street about this. They didn't want to comment on it. Leslie says, I'm no fan of Keir Starmer, but this was disgraceful. Those who thought this was acceptable should be sacked immediately. What should happen now, Barney?
I think there ought to be a real look at it. I think senior leaders ought to get involved in the BBC to find out exactly what went wrong. And, Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross were both taken off air. I wouldn't be recommissioning this programme. I think satire is really, really important. I think we've got to hold our politicians and people in power to account, and I think humour is a great way of doing that. Court jesters were around so that the king could be made fun of, and that's the role. We hold power to account. That's our role as journalists, as programme makers.
I completely agree. I think, holding people to account through comedy is a fantastic way of doing it. But, at this point, I don't think we're kind of holding politicians accountable. were holding, you know, politicians' mothers who are sadly passed away, you know, not to account, but kind of using them as an inroad for comedy. And I feel like that's a bit extensive. You know, take a jab at Rishi Sunak. I mean, like, the whole world took the mick out of Rishi Sunak when he came out on that interview for not being relatable. And he said, oh, I am relatable. You know, when we grew up, I didn't have Sky TV. And everyone's like, Sky TV is a luxury, not a necessity. You know, like, you always had food on your tables. You always had a roof over your head. You know, you're now a multi-billionaire. You're not in touch with society. And, you know, your interview has just proven that. The world took the mick out of him. And that's a great way of doing it, you know, because that's just the way to do it. Because it was aimed at him and something that he said. But this is, I feel personally, still a bit too far. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of Keir. I don't like any really politicians, if I'm honest with you. I don't like any of them. But I do feel like on a human level, this was a little bit too far. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Was this too far? Or do you think that this was fair game? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below while you're down there. Be sure to jump scare the hell out of that like button if you have found this video informative. Subscribe if you're new. Tickle my little bell to get notified whenever we upload to the channel. And until next time, guys, I hope that you have, again, found this informative. And I'll catch you in the next one. Speak to you later. Peace.